So good afternoon, everybody, and thank you for joining us today for the session that will seek to start to answer the question of how we will build more resilient supply chains. And this is part of the conference, Embracing a Movement for Change, organised by the Transform Construction Network Plus. I'm Jan Godsell. I'm Professor of Operations and Supply Chain Strategy at WMG, the University of Warwick, and I am a co-investigator on the Transforming Construction Network Plus. So just before we go into the detail of the session, a few housekeeping issues. The first I'd like to just say is that this session is being recorded. The recording and the slides will be shared after the event. Secondly, we also invite you to comment and share your questions. If you wish to ask a question to the speakers, or if you have any technical issues and need some support, please use the Q&A option that appears at the bottom of your screen. Note that you can choose to ask your questions anonymously or not, though it is all, I would personally say it's quite nice to know who you are, but it is your choice. And you may send your questions at any time during the presentation. So if an idea just dawns on you, ask the question there and then, and we'll curate them up at the end. If you have any comments, please use the chat feature on the screen, but please don't use the chat to ask any questions. And finally, we will also be live tweeting the events using the hashtag TCN+, and feel free to share your thoughts and views on Twitter. So just a little bit of background about the Transforming Construction Network Plus. The Network Plus mobilises a new movement in the community, construction community. It brings together experts from a range of disciplines to tackle some of the most pressing problems across the digital, energy, construction and manufacturing space. The network unites academics, researchers with industry and policy representatives through networking and skill building events, and creates a new community and body of knowledge to inform future construction policy and practice. Network Plus has also provided funding for research projects through funding calls. It is one of the investments for Transforming Construction Challenge, which is the UK government's challenge to the construction industry and research communities to make buildings more affordable, efficient, safer and healthier. The N Plus is a joint project between the Bartlett, UCL's Faculty of the Built Environment, Imperial College London and WMG, the University of Warwick. And I am so proud to be chairing this session because we have a really amazing lineup. We're going to begin with Professor Lisa Ellram, who will present perhaps a view of supply chain resilience from a slightly more general perspective, but then apply it to construction. Nigel Ostime, Sarah Wilkes and Matt Yeates. So it's my great pleasure to hand over to our first speaker, who is Professor Lisa Ellram. She's the University Distinguished Professor and Rees Distinguished Professor of Supply Chain Management in the Department of Management at the Farmer School of Business, Miami University in Oxford, where she teaches logistics, supply chain management at the undergraduate and graduate level. And Lisa always tells me that she's not in Miami, Florida. Prior to that, she was the John and Barbara Bebling. She was the John and Barbara Bebling Professor of Business at Arizona State University. Her primary areas of research interest include sustainability and purchasing, transportation and supply chain management, services purchasing. She published in numerous top journals spanning a variety of disciplines, including managerial and academic outlets. She's co-editor of the Journal of Purchasing and Supply Chain Management and on the editorial board of several other journals. She has co-authored 8 books, including academic books and textbooks, and she's taught and presented in more than 30 countries on 6 continents, though I think you may be slightly more constrained in terms of where you're geographically located to the US, but I know from attending some online webinars that Lisa's held, her global presence is still felt despite the COVID-19 challenge. So without further ado, I'll hand over to Lisa.
Great, thank you. So I'm just waiting to get permission to share my screen here. And while I do that, as Janet indicated, it's not my primary area of expertise to understand the construction industry. So I was doing some reading about it, and I was very interested to find out that when you looked at the problems and issues that people in the construction industry were facing, supply chain was not very high. I had to go all the way down to number 5. So again, I thought that was very interesting because, of course, for me, that is a top issue. So can you see my screen now? Great. Okay, thank you. So as Janet indicated, I am at the real Miami University, and this is what it looks like where I am. The background behind me is a little bit more like what it is right now, but this is a pretty typical day in the spring. So we're the original Miami University. We were founded in Oxford, Ohio, which is not very original of us to call our town Oxford, in 1809. And I'd like to point out to people that Florida was not yet a state then. The other one, the University of Florida, that was actually founded in 1925. So, we were very well established by the time that the University of Florida came around. It's in a little bigger town, and the weather is maybe a little bit nicer there. So people think about that. But I do like to go from one extreme climate to another. So as Janet indicated, before this, I worked at Arizona State, which is probably the hottest large university in the US. But I'm really glad that I was not at ASU this year. Some of you, the numbers don't convert very well, but they had 50 days over 110 degrees this summer. 50 days over 110. So I'll take a little bit of snow if I can avoid those 50 days over 110 any day. So I want to talk a little bit. One of the things that I found over studying supply chain management for a lot of years is that there's a big obsession with cost. Cost is very, very important in supply chain management, and that's okay, but sometimes we go a little too far with our obsession on cost. And what happens is that we stop forgetting some other things that actually hurt us in the long run. So I want to talk about how did we get into the position that we're in, and some of the practices that have put us here, as well as maybe some more innovative ways that we can deal with problems that we're experiencing during COVID-19. So I love Lean principles. I talk about Lean principles a lot in class. And I think, most of you are familiar with these ideas. And one of the main ideas behind Lean is to reduce waste, but reduce waste while you're thinking about what the customer needs. So it's all about the customer, and you should only be doing things that the customer needs, wants, and is willing to pay for. So these universal principles, I think they apply everywhere. They apply in the construction area, but they are somewhat situational. So you have to look at what really is wasteful. And, in my opinion, and you probably agree, all defects are wasteful. You shouldn't have anything that is, basically defective, doesn't meet your standards. Over-processing, so doing more than people want, that's a waste that they're not willing to pay for. Having people standing around waiting, that's a waste of time. And not utilizing the people that you work for and asking them, what are your good ideas? What do you think we should do about this? Also transporting things back and forth multiple times, and extra motion, having extra movement of people that isn't needed. So those, I think, I feel fairly comfortable saying those are almost always wasteful. But what isn't necessarily always wasteful is having more inventory than you need, and overproduction, which is producing more than you really need. So the thing about Lean is Lean works really well in a predictable world with level demand, but we don't have that. We especially don't have that during COVID, but a lot of the time, in just normal day-to-day, we don't have that sort of a world. So you've got to adapt Lean to fit into the situation that you're in, and think about, You know, when are you willing to have buffers? So either extra capacity, like maybe extra people who can come and work for you, extra materials. And when are you just willing to say, you know what, it's too expensive and we're going to stop the supply chain? And I think a lot of companies haven't really thought that through. And it's very difficult. I just recently completed a study of a lot of purchasing practitioners and chief procurement officers, and they talked about how difficult it is to invest in responsiveness. The company doesn't want to pay for assets that aren't being utilized right now. It's very, very tough to justify, but I think it's a conversation that a lot of companies and industries are having right now. How much more should we be willing to pay so that we can respond more quickly when something goes wrong? So some of the practices that have really gotten us into a situation, especially with regard to cost, is low-cost country sourcing. We love low-cost country sourcing. It's not going to go away. You do surveys of companies, and some companies say, yeah, you know, we're thinking about moving some stuff back near shoring. We're thinking about moving things back to our country. But it's really a small amount because everybody wants to have low cost. The issue is, of course, there's a lot of distance. So there's a lot of inventory in transit. There's a lot of delays. And while you might get lower costs, it does hurt responsiveness. And also it often hurts transparency. You don't really know your suppliers as well. You don't know who they're dealing with down the line. You don't have that big picture that you would if you were dealing with a local source or even a national source, and you could visit them and see them more often and understood their culture better. So for leverage, we like to deal with fewer suppliers, but that also means we have limited backup when something goes wrong. And then throughout industry, there's been a big commoditization push where we want to focus so much on cost and price that we standardize things to the point that it can be beneficial in some ways, but then we treat everything as being completely interchangeable. So we don't have to worry about relationships. We don't have to worry about suppliers. We can just trade one for the other. But the problem is that when market shifts in situations like that, you lose out because you don't have the market intelligence. You don't have the relationships with suppliers that are going to keep you kind of on track. So I just thought this was an interesting statistic. And this was just for the US. I wasn't able to find the global number. So global imports from China to the US were 2.5 trillion in 2018, and they were only 179 billion in 1998. So they essentially grew tenfold, more than tenfold. So a huge, huge increase in our dependence there. Also, and I know, so this was one of the #1 concerns in the construction industry, of course, was finances. So this is a huge issue in all industries. So there is that fixation on financial statements. And part of that is you got to have low inventory, right? Because low inventory ties up cash. It increases your assets, which makes your returns look worse. Companies love high payables. They want to use somebody else's cash. So as a result of that, that can kind of stretch your suppliers out, that they then don't have the money to pay their suppliers, and it goes all the way down the supply chain. So I already mentioned this idea, but there's also just this hesitancy to invest in risk management because the return is unknown. We really only know if risk management pays off or not when there's a disaster. So if you've got a few good years in a row, you don't have any disasters, it starts to seem like a waste. And then something like this happens, and the people who are more prepared are able to function better. So the good news is supply chains and people are resilient and they're adaptable. So we've seen just a few examples of some of the great cooperation that organizations have had to address immediate problems. So for example, the global airlines shifted some of their passenger planes, which they weren't using, to fly cargo. Right now, United Airlines has 50 planes that they've just converted to cargo, and they're flying those regularly now. Amazon, for example, they temporarily shifted all of their focus on only delivering essential items. They did that for maybe around 45 or 60 days. They actually lost a lot of business because of that, because people still wanted to buy things and they started buying from other places. But this was a way that they could really help people who needed like the PPE during the pandemic. UPS expanded their healthcare division so that they're focusing just on moving vaccines and treatments. They've built cold storage. They've got everything set up and ready to go if and when, hopefully sooner, we find this vaccine. So we're seeing that companies are adapting and getting more communications and understanding in the supply chain. But the issue is, and this is what you're seeing in your industry, and we're seeing this in all industries, is that there's still rolling shortage and demand unpredictability, because one day there might be a large group of people that don't show up at work and you can't get things done that you want to get done. There's a variety of reasons that they might not show up. Supplies don't arrive, or right now we have the largest demand, I guess the highest price I heard that we've ever had for lumber in the US because of the construction boom. So that creates another level of unpredictability. So the pricing, the shortages, and the demand. So you've just got to be able to continue to adapt to whatever is thrown your way in this environment. So some of these companies are making longer term moves to think about, how do I want to come out of this? How can I be more prepared next time? So we're seeing smart factories, and a lot of people don't like this, but there's a move definitely to many more robots. We're seeing robots in meat packing plants, which have been hit really hard by the pandemic in the US, and they've been shut down. They've had COVID moving through them. We're seeing automated maintenance schedules set up. A lot of things are the uncertainty is being taken away by kind of removing the need for the human touch, which again, there's definite cons in this area as well as the positives. A really important aspect though is this need and this creation of transparency, more digitalizations that were more responsive. It is really hard to invest when business is down, but these are companies who are doing this. They see that they'll be able to adapt and respond better next time, and they're even able to do a better job now as these things come online. A huge issue, and I know this is a big issue for many people in construction, is complexity reduction. So in industry, we talk about stock keeping units, but companies like Coca-Cola, Procter & Gamble, Mondelez, Mattel, they look out there, it's like, really, does somebody need 150 SKUs of toothpaste, different sizes, flavors, colors, everything? So they're really trying to lean their offerings to focus on doing better what the customer really wants and not having so much proliferation, because it's hard to manage. But we still do want these inexpensive inputs. Low-cost country sourcing continues. So we need to look at how we can manage these risks better. And one thing that some companies are doing is they're pre-positioning. So again, this requires an investment. So they're anticipating demand and they're buying things, or they're contracting in advance or buying capacity based on what they hope will happen, and being willing to pay for that if it doesn't actually succeed. So, I don't want to be too, everything's wonderful, because it's not. This is a very difficult time. It is an opportunity to learn, and we have to really think about where we can and can't afford to be lean. We have to think about where we can reduce complexity. Complexity, it makes everything so much more difficult to manage, and transparency makes it easier to manage. But we've got to be willing to make investments and step back. And it's hard to step back when you're in the middle of a crisis and there's a lot going on. But we need to start making more conscious choices about, where we do need backup in our business, food supply chains, healthcare, and looking at who else is in our supply chain and deciding, will we survive together or will we fail together? So I want to leave you with those thoughts, and I'll be happy to have some questions and discussion later. Thank you.
Lisa, thank you very, very much. And I can see that there were some comments particularly endorsing your views around lean principles in the chat. So now we're going to move on to our second speaker, who is Nigel Ostime, Delivery Director for Hawkins Brown. So Nigel co-leads the specialist design student at Hawkins Brown, They're a practice of architects for around 275 people located in London, Manchester, Edinburgh and Los Angeles. Nigel has over 25 years experience in the design and delivery of complex projects, so that touches upon questions of complexity that Lisa mentioned in a range of sectors, but principally residential, commercial and transport infrastructure. Currently, his role focuses on process and productivity, with a particular emphasis on modern methods of construction and digital technologies. So a really nice segue from some of the general supply chain principles and future direction that Lisa presented. So it's over to you, Nigel.
Thank you, Jan. Good afternoon, everyone. Yeah, so my name is Nigel Ostime. I'm an architect and delivery director at Hawkins Brown, an architectural practice, as Jan said, with studios in the UK and the US. I'm going to talk about this topic from a rather different angle, from the perspective of a consultant, a designer. And what I want to say is that for a whole host of reasons, we need to develop greater collaboration within project teams and, critically, earlier engagement of manufacturers into the project process. And this, I feel, will help make our supply chains more resilient. Why is that? Well, as we all know, the construction industry is somewhat unsustainable in its current form. It suffers from boom and bust and low levels of investment and a resultant low level of productivity. And by and large, I think we could say it delivers poor value. To make it more robust, we need to change the way procurement works. And I'm going to propose that standardization and an emphasis on a manufacturing approach is the solution, in part at least. And I'm going to tell you about a program that Hawkins Brown is involved in that aims to do that. So first, I want to tell you a bit about my company, just to put this in context. And I think the context is important. We're a relatively large practice for architects with close to 300 people, and we have a good range of sectors that we operate in, as well as urban design and interior design. I mention this because most architectural practices are micro businesses, with 75% of UK practices being 10 or fewer people. And their outlook on matters like supply chain management will be quite different. And this is important because the industry is really two industries, those operating at the large end and those operating at the micro end, both in terms of projects and business size. And we need to keep that in mind as we discuss this topic. Where Hawkins Brown finds projects particularly interesting is where they cross over and mix sectors, and we're finding that is increasingly the case. So our projects might mix education and workplace, or community with infrastructure, and so on. And this slide shows a few examples of that. We always take care to design using available evidence on building performance through mining data on best practice and benchmarking, and we've been developing digital tools to help do that. Doing this requires a good deal of specialization, though, and has impacted the way that we organize around projects. So we have set up what we call the Specialist Design Studio that I am part of, that provides support to the project teams on specific areas, including computational design, BIM, sustainability, technical design, and offsite, or MMC, modern methods of construction. And the latter is an area I'm particularly interested in, and we've invested quite heavily in developing our knowledge and expertise in this field. And this is relevant to what I'm going to speak about today. So some of you will be familiar with this diagram, which sets out the RIBA, Royal Institute of British Architects plan of work. Please don't try and read it, by the way. I'm just using it as an illustration. While it's targeted at the whole project team, the plan of work is fundamentally focused on design activities and other activities directly related to design. And whilst it encompasses the whole project, and indeed under stage 7, the life of the built asset, the building in use, it doesn't really deal with supply chain management. As an architectural practice, we naturally focus on the sort of things architects focus on, like helping develop the brief. So here that is under stages 0 and 1. Designing the building, stages 2 and 3. Getting planning permission, developing the employer's requirements for the tender stage. And then usually we are novated to the contractor to work alongside the subcontractors and suppliers in finalising the technical design, stages 4 and 5. We also now take on the role of principal designer under the CDM health and safety regulations. Fundamentally though, we are typically the design team lead and manage the output of the other design consultants, the engineers, landscape architects, interior designers, and so on. Traditionally, architects don't really concern themselves with supply chains and supply chain management, which we generally leave to the contractor. But this is starting to change with the advent of increasing use of MMC and what has come to be called the Design for Manufacture and Assembly, or DFMA, process. This ties in very closely to digital technology, and a lot of the R&D we are involved in bring these two things together. A good example is where we are currently part of a consortium collaborating on a government-funded Innovate UK R&D project, which we won through the Transforming UK Construction Round 2 MMC Digital and Whole Life Performance Programme. We've called the consortium CoLab, and Hawkins Brown is working with a housing association, L&Q, another architectural practice, HTA, and a technology company, Virtual Viewing. The software we're developing will provide a central database within which standard components or products can be stored and selected. These would include bathroom pods, utility cupboards, and pre-manufactured balconies, as well as entire apartment layouts. Critically, it will make the client and the design team think about how the homes will be built from the outset. We're aiming to have the toolkit ready by June next year, and when completed, CoLab will partner with housing associations, local authorities, and house builders to roll it out. This particular piece of work follows on from an exercise that we've been undertaking for the last 2 years to develop standard apartment designs, developed in such a way as to be capable of being constructed in a range of different off-site solutions and materials without the need to change the layout. This provides the flexibility needed by the client to achieve the economies that standardization delivers without being tied into a single source supplier with all the inherent risks that that brings. To achieve it, we've had to work directly with the suppliers, which has required extensive engagement with, for example, the bathroom pod manufacturers, balcony manufacturers, and so on. So this is one area we've been actively engaging with the supply chain to make sure we have a deep understanding of the various systems so that we can embed them into the concept. The DFMA toolkit will give designers direct access to the suppliers by enabling the designer to select products, by which, to reiterate, I mean sub-assemblies or indeed entire apartments, through the digital interface of the app. It's critical to bear in mind that if we as designers are to implement MMC, we must make a fundamental shift in the way we design buildings. We need to understand how the building will be manufactured and assembled, even as we make our first concept design sketches. As I said earlier, architects have traditionally designed buildings, then sought input from engineers and suppliers to develop the technical design. And this means we often get planning permission for a building with a design that's not been fully coordinated, largely because the developers are unwilling to invest more than they have to, as the process carries significant risk. But this and the race to the bottom tendering processes are causing significant quality failures, and we've found just how deep this runs through the Edinburgh Schools inquiry and the deeply distressing Grenfell Tower inquiry. We have to change, and the sort of approach using MMC that I'm outlining will resolve many of the issues. So by developing a kit of parts, as I've outlined above, the early design can be based on actual components. So with an initial investment, such as we're doing with the DFMA toolkit, significant productivity increases can be derived further down the line, and the supply chain can be developed to fit with that program. Another example of a digital app that uses this sort of platform approach is Seismic, developed by a team led by Bryden Wood. And you can see a screen grab of it on the left-hand side here. Seismic is an open source app which has been developed to accelerate the design process for primary schools. The user can configure a school by placing clusters of rooms which comply with the area and adjacency requirements set out by the DFE. The app is free and it's very easy to use. The project lead at Bryden Wood, Jamie Johnson, likes to compare it to Minecraft, and they demonstrated by having school children design school designs on it without any previous experience. They've produced a similar app for residential design called Prism, which has manufacturer's data built into it, and like Seismic, it is free and open source. The middle image and the one on the right show their work for GlaxoSmithKline in what they call a factory in a box, where components are color-coded so as to make erection of the building straightforward and not requiring skilled labour. This is the sort of collaboration with manufacturers which has the potential to revolutionise how we work with and manage supply chains. And finally, this is Hawkins Brown's build-to-rent development in Stratford East Village in London, which we are developing with contractor Mace using their innovative HRS system, high-rise system, along with bathroom pods, utility cupboards, pre-manufactured M&E risers and so on. It's currently on site and it's due for completion later next year. The various systems we've incorporated into it have significantly reduced the programme time and improved quality. And to do that, we've engaged with the manufacturers working alongside Mace. This sort of collaboration, which will be continued by Mace on the next project to see continuous improvement, will give continuity to the supply chain and on that basis, make it more resilient. But it can only happen in an efficient way if the designers are involved in critical decisions related to construction at the outset. The platform approach is one way of developing a more resilient supply chain, but there are a range of categories of MMC that the government helpfully defined last year, and it will be increasingly important for architects to have a thorough understanding of them all and to bring this knowledge to bear on the early design stages, RIBA stage 2 and 3, and to do that, to have a good level of understanding of the manufacturing supply chain. So in conclusion, to make our supply chains more resilient, we need to follow a DFMA approach where we increase collaboration, not just within the design team, but across the whole project team. So including client, contractor, and critically manufacturers. And to do this, we must engage with the manufacturers at a much earlier stage in the project process, RIBA stage 2, ideally. We need to invest in developing knowledge of the manufacturing supply chain. We need to standardize what can be standardized. And we need to do this on digital platforms that mine data for best practice benchmarks and value-driven product selection. Thank you.
Thank you very, very much, Nigel. And I think that will bring us nicely on to Sarah Wilkes, who's the Global Solutions Director and lead for business advisory at Arcadis. So Sarah is leading across the portfolio of Arcadis solutions, ensuring that they bring the best of Arcadis to serve the needs of their clients, driving innovation and transformation. Her particular expertise is in strategy development, digital transformation, and therefore she leads the business advisory capability globally. She has more than 20 years of experience working in the AEC industry and has spent the last few years really driving digital transformation and exploring new business models for the industry. She's really passionate about driving a positive change in the AEC industry to build a more sustainable world, and is currently working closely with ACE on the future consultancy in respect of new business models linked to the Construction Innovation Hub's work on the Value Toolkit. Over to you, Sarah.
Thank you, Jan, and really great to be here and great listening to Lisa and Nigel. I think you might make a few references to some of the things that have been said, which is always great. So not too many slides from me. I'm just going to focus on this one. So Nigel was quite right when he said that consultancy comes in many forms in our industry, and particularly there are large consultancies and there are lots of niche consultancies, and all play a role in the supply chain of the construction and the built environment industry. Arcadis is a large company. We're a global company with about 30,000 people. But I think where I want to focus for the 10 minutes that I've got to speak is actually there's a lot of talk in our industry about business models. There's a lot of talk about the construction industry demanding new business models, and consultancy and contractors looking at what that means for them and their organisations. I think if we take a step back from that, I've been working with the Association of Consultants and Engineering for around about 12 months now, and that's linked to the Construction Innovation Hub work on the Value Toolkit, as Jan mentioned. You know, us as consultants can come up with all the great ideas to transform our industry, but if clients can't buy in that way and they can't articulate what they want from us, then actually we're going to get stuck quite quickly in not being able to transform our industry. So there are 4 building blocks for me of things that have really changed for us and for our clients. You know, from a construction perspective, our clients spread the span of government, organisations, regulated industries, developers, investors, you know, heavy infrastructure activity. So we've got a very broad spectrum of clients, and their customers will be very diverse as well. But there is this rise in customer centricity, and us as consultants, not just understanding our clients, but understanding the needs of their customers and how we translate that into what we deliver for them. And that's really important. I think it was a point that Lisa made really early on. If it's not desirable and nobody wants it, then we're not going to go very far. So that's a really important component of the business models of the future, and therefore how the supply chain forms. I think there's been a lot of reference to digital transformation. For me, the stark reality is you can standardise and automate all you like, but if the client wants to buy people and he's still in that mindset of buying people, the value erodes quite quickly, and there's no real incentive for organisations to drive towards those efficient and effective ways of delivering services or outcomes. So I think the work that we're doing currently as part of the Value Toolkit and the what was called the Client Approach Framework is about how we can help organisations better articulate what's valuable to them, recognising that value can be interpreted and articulated in very different ways depending on what the need is at any one point in time. But in our industry, we have quite a project, what I would call a project by project mindset, which means that we often start something and it goes along in a waterfall manner through different gateways and milestones. And by the time we've got to the end of it, people are saying, is that really what we wanted to get out of it? So if organisations value high quality outcomes, but also value innovation, then how do we blend traditional waterfall approaches to manage the risk and to manage budgets and all the things that a lot of organisations have to do, but how do we build in some of those agile methodologies to really exploit innovation and bring about change, particularly on long-term infrastructure projects. So, you know, the technology that's now available to us is changing on a monthly basis. If you're procuring an organisation to deliver something for 20 years, what's your innovation strategy? How do you bring different partners in during the lifespan of that big programme? You know, all that needs to be really clear at the outset before it gets anywhere near a procurement department, quite frankly. And also, you know, moving on to the world of work, you know, consultancy is changing quite dramatically, I think. I think how long will big companies like Arcadis survive? That might sound quite strange coming from the fact that I work for them, but the gig economy is alive and well and thriving, and more people, a lot of my friends, a lot of people in our industry are starting to make choices about, do I really need to work for just one company? And also I think clients are saying, well, who are the best people to solve my problem? And often talk in these kind of sessions that the trip advisor of consultancy is probably not that far away. Well, we all get rated as individuals and then there's nowhere to hide. So the quality of what we deliver, we will be judged on, and it'll be very public. And that will force change in the whole supply chain environment as well, as it's done in other industries. And probably sort of to talk a little bit about the whole business model concept as well. I think lots of people talking about it, but it's still a relatively new concept in the construction industry. We've had the same business models for a very, very long time, where generally clients buy people and they pay hours for those people to deliver something to them. And I think there are different ways in which we can now deliver value. And I think it was Nigel that put the slide up about Grenfell. The challenge with where we're heading, and it's really dangerous territory, is if we go into lowest cost and commoditisation, because we're falling into the trap of race to the bottom. Price is no longer a proxy for value. So how do we change that dialogue? And I do really believe that the work that we're doing on the value toolkit is starting to give people some tools and some real sense of direction around how we clearly articulate that value, and that's going to be really important to the resiliency in the supply chain. So people know what they're being asked to do, they know what their role in the whole supply chain mechanism looks like, and actually we form stronger ecosystems, where people may be doing similar roles, but the size of the market is big enough for everybody to do that, but there's a real clear pipeline of activity that people can get. And probably just to sort of land on a final point really is that I think we've got to work closer together. I think one of the things, I can put my company loyalties aside, but we've also got to be really open about what's not worked and be a lot clearer about the failures in our environment. We are the least productive next to agriculture and fisheries, I think, even then they might be overtaking the construction industry in terms of digital transformation and productivity. Which is quite a scary place to be. I think McKinsey spelt it out in one of their last reports that we've increased 1% in the last 20 years, which is quite shameful actually as an industry. So there's a bit of a call to arms at the moment around this, I think, with government and bodies like the Construction Innovation Hub leading the way to get us all behind the change. And I'll leave it there, Jan.
Sarah, thank you very, very much. So we move on to our last presentation of the session before we move on to the Q&A panel discussion. And our last speaker is Matt Yeates. Matt is the Managing Director for Digital Ventures at Tata Steel Europe. Before that, and actually this is how I met Matt, he actually was in a supply chain leadership role with Tata Steel Europe. And he was actually doing some quite leading edge work around sales and operations planning, and something that I'm particularly fond of, demand profiling and supply chain segmentation. And he used those sorts of skills to drive a major transformation program across the business. More recently, he's been focused on digital transformations in the supply chain and commercial space, actually creating some new business ventures. So a very nice lead on from Sarah. So over to you, Matt.
Thanks, Jan. Hi, everyone. I recognise people in different time zones. So, yeah, Jan's given a very nice introduction to some of the things I've been involved with in the past and what I'm doing at the moment. I'll caveat that I'm not specifically allied to the construction sector activities in Tata, although I'm aware of many of the things that are going on and done a bit of preparation ahead of this. So if there's any construction bloopers from me, I apologise now. So what you see here actually is a Tata product, the Confloor decking. It's one of our longer leg products, so it goes through one of the most transformation processes before it actually gets to a place where it can be installed. And it's part of a range of many more Tata products. So what I was going to do is just give a quick overview of Tata Steel in the UK context. we're still the biggest steel company in the UK, making flat products and some downstream longer leg products into hollow sections and construction products made in North Wales predominantly. So the integrated steelworks activities happens in South Wales, and as you can see, there's some logistics and warehousing involved in moving some of that stuff around the construction and around the UK to point of use and into different construction applications. So it's a business that regularly features in the headlines for trying to keep finding that sustainable operation economically and also in terms of environmental context as well. And today it's facing some problems, as many are across the different sectors, but it's still employing 8,500 people in the UK. So what do we offer? Just to put some context around it, there's three kind of sections of the product range that we bracket. Those things which clad and go on the outside of the building, which will be very familiar to the experts on this conference. Our more structural products, which you can see in some stadia and some bigger public spaces, and some engineering solutions which you might see driving around the UK in terms of some of the gantries, barriers and floor plates that you walk across in various activities. So a number of different applications and some quite different transformation chains to make those products. So linking to the point above, and this is for illustration only, and I accept, I've learned a lot through the day today as well, just listening to a couple of the other discussions, and there are so many stakeholders in what happens on that green block, if you like, the main contractor or the project site. And the complexity that goes into bringing all of those things to that place is immense. And I guess you can apply many different supply chain concepts at large levels, and they also work in the smaller subcomponents of the value chain as well. What I was just going to call out here is some of the drivers that we see as a steel manufacturer around the key players. And Nigel's outlined the architect, developer and client perspective from how things come together, the aesthetics of performance, the operational costs, and then some of the challenges about bringing price, delivering quality to the site as well as compliance. And we see a number of different challenges in the players that we interact with at specification point versus some of the challenges in the steel supply chain as it moves through those different stakeholders, and that can be a number of nodes through the value chain. And to me, I can draw some parallels to scheduling and integrated steelworks on a daily basis, which you have 10 or 15 major operations, each with their own individual requirement to meet quality and efficiencies, but they don't all nicely move into the same schedule that moves one piece through each one consecutively. So that complexity is, I think, very obvious in the construction value chain, as you guys will understand. I was going to touch on some of the digital enablers that we as Tata Steel see in the product ranges that we have as a requirement, and some of the activities that support supply chain. I've used the chevrons here from specification, the collaboration that goes into the actual design work and construction, to how things operate in service. And then something I think we really need to consider for the future is reuse. And we've got some different axes here that the matrix is calling out. There's common stuff that it's becoming more common and more usable now. We've built our own capability around BIM to enable our data to be used. We are continuing to try and understand and challenge ourselves to bring digital traceability to the physical pieces that go from a steel plant batch of 300 tons into a 30 kilo hollow section in a stadium, if you like, because really that identification through its in-service operation and reuse is critical to making the best use of it. We, as many people our manufacturing production data to this is, and in-use performance and the monitors that go alongside that are something that we're exploring as to how to bring that value into our own product range. One of the things I've been doing for the last 3 years, after having a slight diversion from my supply chain focus, has been around how digital can bring some commercial value into the chain. And this is a suite of products that we've brought together under the banner of Steel Scout to try and bring value. And it was really interesting listening to the data and the platform discussion earlier, where we're offering solutions right up and down that value chain. And I think it's so true to really think about the people that you're trying to appeal to. What I can say is, steel's an industry with a very long history and heritage that rightly so people should be proud of, but it's also very traditional sometimes in its thinking. It's got modern cutting edge process technology, but I think in terms of moving on some of the ways it integrates in the value chain, I can absolutely draw parallels with what I've witnessed in transforming people in digital thinking in steel to some of the things I've heard people talk about in construction today. I think there's a challenge to get that incentive, that reason to change in that B2B context, because currently we don't see a big pressure to change, but we do see a lot of people recognizing that this is a key enabler for the future. And being that first mover often requires some big investments and some big bets, and through the value chain people are in different positions to be able to afford to do that. However, that position of digital in the future I think is key. One of the key things here that I've heard reinforced through the day also is what I've used to try and summarize the Tata Steel response to what we see as the market needs around productivity and digital integration and sustainability. So, our construction product portfolio and the systems today certainly fulfill the traditional supply chain requirements that we've seen, and we're starting to work, as I've highlighted, towards what the future looks like, seeing the DFMA as a key enabler for the future. And the wedges here are just highlighting how I think we'll see the diminishing necessity and relevance of traditional supply chains, and us needing to think about new supply chains with that ever-increasing end-to-end view. And one of the biggest drivers for that, I think, will be sustainability requirements in the circular economy. And that position of how things become repurposed or reused will require some very new thinking, because I'm not sure there's to point to one for me that's looking at that particular part of the market's expectations at this point in time. So just to wrap up and maybe lead into some of the discussions, I kind of posed some questions here to myself, really, and I took this this chart on the right hand side as a thought provoker in that sense, because if you look at it, there's a decade on the x-axis there from where we are today to the future that is showing such a massive change in traditional ways of approaching construction towards platform type models, that there must be something that enables that can bring parallel benefits from other supply chain activities as well across different sectors. And I think that sharing and learning is where maybe it's there's some boundaries that don't need to be there. So as Lisa's started the discussion here, that's lean thinking where it's appropriate, that end-to-end waste reduction and lead time compression have got to be significant components of the future of construction. I think done in the right way, that will start to promote some productivity benefits through the value chain as well. And then that overall risk assessment process and the ownership, whether it's data or real-time visibility from some of the planning tools and visibility capability that was described by Mark in the previous section, and focusing on those key outcomes for me has got to be, I believe, through a slightly different lens for the future. So at that point, I'll hand back to you, Jan, and I think we've got some interesting questions coming in.
So it's now my pleasure to be able to open up the discussion to our panelists from the participants on the webinar. We've had some questions in already, but please do feel free to add to them. I think I'm going to start, there's some themes to these questions, though some of them are more specific than others. And there is definitely a theme running through the questions about standardization versus complexity. So I would just like to just start with a relatively simple question to all the panel, which is to what extent are construction supply chains so complex that they can't be addressed through principles of standardization? And shall I start with Nigel?
I wish you hadn't. No, I'm not sure that's one that I'm best placed to answer, really. But I mean, just in terms of complexity, creating complexity in buildings, but using standardization, I think I'd like to emphasize that standardization doesn't mean a completely uniform appearing built environment. And that's something which, I hadn't said in my piece, but I'm very keen to emphasize. What I'm talking about is standardizing the sort of core of the building. So I talked about bathroom pods and things like that. The sort of things that actually the user of the building wouldn't even necessarily be aware of. But we've got to start standardizing these sort of components. And we talk about getting sort of significant complexity, but through mass customization is a term that we often use. That particularly with digital technologies, it's really quite easy to produce. That image that I showed of one of our buildings at the end. Use some technology to help work out the distribution of the different coloured panels, for example. We didn't design it, we programmed it and looked at options that way. So I think just because we're talking about standardization, it doesn't mean to say that we have a sort of uniform appearance in the built environment. I think that's really important.
No, I think that's a really good point, Nigel. I remember when we we're looking at product complexity just say within a car, and there's a difference between the variety you offer to the customer and what sits behind that in terms of the complexity of the build. And I do wonder sometimes whether people get confused between the ability to offer variety and then the complexity that sits behind that in terms of the delivery of the project. Sarah, you're nodding. Have you got anything to add?
Yeah, I think there is a misconception, I think, around standardisation from a lot of different angles. And we've certainly been on that journey with our own people internally and also our clients. I think standardisation, to go back to Lisa's principles earlier around the sort of the lean principles as well, only do it if it adds value. So if there is a real reason to standardise something and you can break things down into smaller parts and there's value in doing so, then that's the reason to do it. But I think it's also a mindset shift. So from a consultancy environment where everything's bespoke for the client and the client doesn't want you to reuse things, we have examples where a client says, don't price it on the basis of doing it for us. Don't just throw me your last design, or don't just throw me the last project that you did. But actually, that's exactly what they should be asking for. So there's a mindset and a culture shift in our industry to say, if it's been done before and the risks are better known and we know that the costs are better known, then actually you're benefiting from that, and we should drive that standardization through some of the processes. But starting with that mindset. But I mean, we use a term in our world that standardization is not sexy, so everybody's doing automation, but you can't automate without the standardization piece as well. So there's a bit of a sequence to how it all flows as well, and that also helps sort of frame the mindset in terms of what you're trying to achieve and where the value can be delivered as well.
No, absolutely. I know when I was doing some work in the infrastructure sector, that everybody wants to be innovative, actually not everything requires an innovative solution. Actually, some of them we just want a standard solution that can be repeated.
Absolutely, yeah.
But I think everyone thinks that perhaps the value comes through being innovative, and actually sometimes the innovation could be in different forms. Matt, in terms of the Tata Steel business, how do you see this sort of complexity, standardization, variety play out, I suppose, with your clients and across your product range?
Yeah, so I think it's building on the last point. It really depends how, for me, a smart supply chain, you can take a standard component really as close as you can to end use and configure at the last possible moment. And, even when in use, some of the panels and systems that Tata's developing now can be, switched and changed around in the building terms in relatively short timescales as well, both internally and externally. So, I think that type of approach to standardization and then that postponement as far as you can to make it unique will really bring value. And to Nigel's point as well, looking at where you can have resilience because you've got kind of duality in the supply chain in terms of the number of places you can get standard components supplied from, and they fit. It gives you layers of protection in your project lead time, I would imagine.
So hold that thought about duality because we'll come back to that. But I just like a last comment from Lisa, who I think a lot of this comes back to some of the principles that you started with, but also you may have some insights for good practice from other sectors as well.
So I was so excited to hear all this supply chain talk sector. Nigel's just throwing these advanced supply chain concepts around like nobody's business. So I think it's really exciting. I was really interested to hear about, some of the modular approaches. And my goodness, when you said the word postponement, I'm like, this is it. This is great. So, and mass customization. So what I think is so important, it's been a real struggle, and this goes back to what Nigel emphasized time and again, is the whole design process. The cost, the supply chain is based on what is designed. The cost is based on what is designed. So you really have to get the people who are doing the design to embrace these principles, and it's very difficult because sometimes, you think of architects as maybe they're being rewarded for doing these cool and funky buildings. Like I don't know what that building, like the Barcelona building, and I've seen, there's two of those that like Tata Steel has been involved in. Those are amazing buildings. Every architecture wants to design a building like that. So how can you change the mindset of people to say, you're going to be rewarded for doing something that we can deliver. You're going to be rewarded for doing something that we can have some modularity and some standardization up front, and then we can make beautiful through the mass customization process. So you have to really look at changing the mindset and the reward structure of the people in the industry. I have to say, this hasn't happened as much in manufacturing as it should. Somebody had a comment on here, what can you do about some of these issues when purchasing is still focused on cost? Well, you can't have purchasing just being focused on costs. You really have to get the other people in the supply chain and the designers to say, okay, we're jointly accountable for creating this fantastic product and meeting the customer's needs, but doing it at a cost and creating a supply chain that we can support and not being embarrassed later, like the terrible problems that Nigel said, because we have the race to the bottom to get the cheapest thing out there that would minimally meet our needs. So yeah, I think I'm excited to see the direction that you're going. I think it looks great.
So there's about 3 follow-on questions. I just want to build for me, but I'm going to come to the finance one first. So it's a different type of cost, which was a question that's raised by Kerry Mashford. But I think a couple of you have touched on this in your answers to the question I just posed. And this is the idea that actually, how do we resolve the difficulty of that investment that's potentially required in the initial design work, especially if we're going to develop platform-based systems, if that investment is required ahead of not even just getting planning, but potentially getting any order or winning any business for that particular piece of work. So any volunteers to pick up that one? Nigel?
Yeah, no, I'm much happy to answer that one. I think this is why I made the point that the industry is completely, has these two opposing levels. It's got the very large end of the industry and the sort of micro business end. And a lot of it is at the micro business end, and this is why it's quite largely fragmented. But the fact is that the larger end, generally speaking, does have the resources to invest in these sort of things. And it does require investment, but those that can afford to invest in this sort of upfront development will reap the benefits, because it will have improvements in productivity and quality and all those other things. But yes, it does have to happen at the front end. And I think, you know, one way of dealing with it is for people, for organizations to come together and collaborate to share the load, which is certainly what we do. In terms of R&D.
It's not a particular organisation, but what always struck me about Dyson is right the way from the word go, everything was designed on CAD, everything was rapid prototyped, and that just became, that was a way of working 25 years ago for a company that started as an SME. So I think sometimes it might be about a mindset and what you choose to invest in, and Dyson's obviously a very design-led organisation, and that's where they've chose to make their investment. Sarah, you're nodding. Do you have anything to add?
Yeah, well, I just want to highlight, I mean, it was I was on a webinar this week with Lendlease, actually. So Lendlease, a big sort of investor developer around the globe. They've just launched their digital twin platform with Google. So it's also about the ecosystem, and to Nigel's point, there's deep pockets out there that are circling the construction industry because they know there is latent value in it because of the relatively low productivity. So there's gains to be had, and you're starting to see some people experiment. And I think to your point around the prototyping, getting people to buy into a vision and the ecosystem coming together to really drive that vision. Yes, there's an element of risk. But without that, we won't change the industry. So I think we've also got to take that minimum viable product mindset into our world and start testing some of this stuff. And I think that's, you know, in effect what Nigel was talking about when he talked about seismic and prism. You know, who knows where they will go, but it's almost like get in the car and start driving. You don't know where your roadblocks are, but if you don't start driving, you're never going to get to where you need to get to. And I think that's what we need in the industry more than ever now is people that have got a bit brave, but that sense of we're in it together as well, because we all know we need to transform, and doing it from our own respective organisations is not going to change the industry environment.
So Lisa, obviously you've been involved with a number of your colleagues looking at supply chain resilience, particularly in this sort of post-COVID period. Is there anything to learn from reflecting on that in terms of where perhaps design has paid off, or how people have approached collaborating to actually deliver?
Well, there's a few things that they're kind of almost unrelated to each other, but they are related so I look at, even though I'm in the US, I'm kind of in between where I'm located, Honda and Toyota geographically. So I've been studying Honda, I hate to say it, like since 1990. And they are both companies that have very, very strong platform approaches. And the idea behind this platform approach is, if you can, as we're going to our new models, if you can tell me how something new provides value and the customer is willing to pay for it, we'll build that in. But if not, we're not going to change it. So there's a big push there. And you know, all the US automotive companies, and probably really all the automotive companies around the world, have sort of copied that platform approach. So they really have to justify. I mean, it's not that they want innovation, but it's not innovation for innovation's sake. It's innovation for value. So I think we need to get that mindset. It has to be innovation for value. The other thing is, and this is really hard, and many companies fall down on this. Honda does not fall down on this. When things are tough, they get behind their suppliers. So like if like right now suppliers are hurting, Honda is going to be paying them faster. They're not going to be paying them slower. If they see their supplier quality drop, they don't go and beat up their supplier. They're like, what is going on? You know, we see this happening. Let's, you know, what's changed in your process? What can be done? So it is sort of this mindset that we're going to win together. You know, we are dependent on each other. We need each other. We're in it together for the long haul. And anything that we do, any changes that we make, there have to be a really positive, good reason. Again, so I want it to be clear. It's not like they don't want change. They just don't want change for change's sake.
Yeah.
So I think those are important things. And it sounds like the construction industry probably needs a lot of change up front right now, which you're going through, and then, you know, to see what sticks and what really makes sense in terms of value. But I think that you will probably find the way that you're going about it, that the platform approach for housing and office buildings and large construction is a great approach to take, to just focus on the value that people are really willing to pay for.
Brilliant, Lisa, thank you. And Matt, you're somebody that's perhaps moved from a more traditional business model to actually a sort of much more venture capital type of model, which comes back to some of the questions around funding and creative funding. Have you got any insights from sort of forming Digital Scout or some of the other digital ventures within Tata Steel for other organisations looking, I suppose, to look at this problem in a slightly different way?
Well, it's a tricky question. I mean, we've been very focused on our industry, if you like, and solving some of the problems within it. Because I think that, you know, that's the key thing. It's not digital for digital's sake. It's a bit like Lisa was just saying. You know, you should do something because it's going to bring value. I think in that context, we've funded our own activities that way. I think what we are fast realizing actually is if you're going to scale them quickly, you have to do it with a broader audience. And I think, you know, I'm just listening to Nigel's presentation. You can see that collaboration between some of the key players in the value chain, I think, is really key. Which is the point, you know, I was making. If I look at the parallels between scheduling major units in the steel plant and bringing together the major components of a value chain, a construction value chain in a build, then they'll absolutely be the same. They'll have contrasting requirements. So you're trying to manage all the way through that chain. And, you know, in the steel plant, it was easier because you lift the supply chain function above that to oversee that end-to-end value. I think the question is, can you use digital to lift, you know, an independent view above that in the construction value chain as well?
You touched on one of my favourite topics, which is around planning and planning capability, which is what you had oodles of in your steel scheduling example, but perhaps the importance of planning and that type of coordination is a skill. It's a different sort of skill, perhaps, to the more traditional project and programme and portfolio management skills that we see within the construction industry. Which sort of brings me on to, there's another set of questions, or there's a theme that's run through. I think it's run through all of your presentations, and I can see it as a theme in the questions from the audience, which is that the P word, and unfortunately it's not my planning word, it's the procurement word. And it started, you know, Lisa talked about the race to the bottom and this obsession with cost. The specific question that Chris Mackenzie-Grieve asked was about that standardisation. It was more of a statement that standardisation won't solve the procurement problem as long as procurement is focused mainly on lowest capital cost. I suppose I'm just going to ask you all to focus generally on what's the role that you think procurement practices play currently in enabling or inhibiting a more effective and efficient construction supply chain, and then one thing that we might do differently. And I'm going to start with Lisa this time, because I think you actually started your presentation with this talk of race to the bottom, and I know that you have a lot of expertise in procurement.
So this is a really tough area, believe it or not. So I've talked to, again, this is an area I've been studying for a long, long time. I have to make a confession. I'm trained as an accountant. So I was actually an accountant before I went back to get my PhD. And I didn't like some of what I saw, which is one of the reasons that I did not continue to be an accountant. But the problem is so much of the mindset. So procurement, they are given these goals by top management, by the leadership of the company. They, believe me, the procurement professionals I know, they do not want their life to be about cost. They do not want their life to be about cost, but that is what companies evaluate and measure them on more than anything else. So it does have to be more of a mindset change. And I think one of the ways to do that is to spread the accountability so that it's not just procurement who's responsible for cost, but it's the designers who are held accountable, sort of like a target cost that we need to build the building for this price. And, you know, here's maybe where we have play. But then the procurement has to be also completely and totally accountable for whatever the designers are talking about in terms of value. They have to be saying, we are not sacrificing value. We have just as much weight on quality, value that the customer needs. So I think it is really, and we talk about this all the time, shared goals. It just doesn't happen in practice. It just doesn't happen. It's too complicated. It's particularly important, again, going back to Nigel's point, during the design phase. But purchasing, yes, it is a problem. I am going to say it's a problem because that's what's measured. And a lot of the other things that procurement does don't get noticed, they don't get recognized, they don't get valued. So that's something that procurement is struggling with. It's something I'm studying. It's something I just did a report on. I don't have the answers. I can just identify the problem. But one of them is through shared goals, definitely.
Yeah. I think I also, I suppose it links more to infrastructure, but I was doing some actually work with MOD around submarines. You might say, what on earth have they got to do with infrastructure? But there's a fair few parallels. I sometimes think that the way we get the procurement process and the request for quotation process, where it tries to overly specify everything and then hold people to account, you know, sometimes it'd be better to have that more grown-up conversation about what money is available and then to trust people to design the best solution. So I do sometimes wonder whether design to cost might be a way out of some of this, Nigel.
Well, I was going to say, I think procurement is absolutely at the root of this. And I can tell you that as architects, we find it hugely frustrating. We have a sort of the predominant procurement is design and build. And it's fundamentally because clients don't want to, they want to divest themselves of owning risk. And that's sort of understandable. If you go back, 30 years and what was happening in the industry then. And so it was a sort of result of that, but, perhaps it swung too far. And I do think it depends on the client type. So I think where we have a better experience is clients who are developing for themselves. So they are going to own and manage the asset because they've got more interest in investing up front in what they're producing because, but it's the sort of other end of the scale where the sort of trader developers, typically in house building, where they're going to probably flip the site at planning and they really don't care about quality at all. And they just want to get optimize the value of their site. And that's a real problem because it means that there's not enough invested at the front end. So, quite often we will be the only consultant. There won't be an engineer involved even, let alone the suppliers. So if we can change in some way, if we can change that, that would be good. But it's sort of fundamental because the reason that procurement is like that is because clients are averse to risk and their business models are set up in that way. So it's not to belittle the problem is an enormous one, but it's certainly at the root of the problem, I think.
Yeah, and Matt, as Tata Steel, I suppose you can be both poacher and gamekeeper, either a customer, you've got either a supplier to your customers, but equally you have suppliers too. So what's your views on role of procurement?
Yeah, look, I think it's pretty difficult. Nobody wants to pay more than a fair price, right? And I think that's what it comes down to. And I'd go back to Lisa's point that the procurement drivers, I think, come from leadership. And leadership are driven by the stakeholders that they have. And just heard some stuff from Nigel that kind of makes sense around the client wanting to de-risk. But maybe another perspective that we take sometimes as Tata Steel is, what's the outcome that you want? And cost of capital in our value chain, or the working capital to fund our value chain, is huge. And actually having a lower inventory because you've got a more reliable supplier versus the ultimate purchase price being lower, the trade-off just doesn't even register. So you need to be focused on the right outcome, I think.
No, absolutely. And this is where, if you take a totally different sector and just think about something like grocery retailing, it's why we see the likes of Aldi and Lidl do so well, because they've kept demand stable. They contract in quite a traditional, old-fashioned way, but their suppliers know exactly what's required. The buffers in that supply chain, coming back to a point Lisa made right at the start, are minimal. And so it's a very effective and efficient supply chain that delivers, yes, it's a more limited customer offering, but it does deliver customer value, probably at the lowest possible supply chain cost. Sarah, any last thoughts on procurement?
Well, let me give you one other comparison, and you can probably colour it better than I can, but automotive, going back a few years, would kind of push the pressure right back down the supply chain. And I think that behaviour is changing now, and they're wanting to understand what's happening further down the supply chain because of the impact it ultimately has on them. But people try and manage their costs, and then ultimately the fragility starts to expose itself.
No, absolutely. And I think actually in construction, particularly on some of the bigger mega projects like Terminal 5, you have seen these different models of contracting, such as behavioural contracting, and perhaps a different way of looking at risk pooling and risk sharing. The thing that always just surprises me, in a good old manufacturing environment, you set up a call-off order and you just call the stuff off. We never have quite the same discussions about risk management as you do in construction. And I've never quite understood that. Maybe it's just because I'm sure over time the same amount of, I don't know if you've got any last thoughts on procurement, Sarah.
Yeah, I think it probably touched on something I said earlier, that it almost starts one step before. I think it's to Matt's point, there's a leadership challenge in here, and there's a little bit of self-awareness on the buyer. What kind of buyer am I? Am I somebody that knows what I want? Or am I somebody that is not informed, therefore I'm not sure what I want? And on a spectrum of innovation, how far am I prepared to go? And all those things mean, you've got to have different strategies by then which to engage the market. What we find often in consultancy is, particularly I would say with the public sector, and I can say this because I'm doing some work with some of the public sector departments, is we've got people buying technical services, whether that's engineering or design or quantity surveying or program management, but they don't have any experience in those technical disciplines. So they're buying things in and they're managing those things in quite a prescriptive way, and that causes a lot of stress in the contract environment. So I think there's a lot to be done there, but it starts actually with the people accountable in the organisation that's buying or procuring the service or the product and wanting to deliver something, and then having a degree of self-awareness around, well, where am I on that spectrum? And I think that's what we're trying to flush out and be more open about, is recognise yourself and then align your procurement strategy behind that, and be really honest with the market about where you stand on that spectrum.
No, absolutely. So there's two angles that I want to pull out next. One, just looking at some of the questions, I can see that indirectly they start to talk about, someone's talking about climate change. But I know that Matt mentioned in his presentation circular economy, business models. I've also heard the word fairness used. And if we think about something like Global Sustainable Development Goal number 12, which is about responsible consumption and production, these ideas that maybe we should be buying less, and maybe the equivalent is building less, building green, building fair. I just wondered, as we move forward, you know, to 2030, how can we see perhaps the supply chain contributing to a more sustainable and possibly circular construction industry? Anybody wants to comment on that first? I don't know whether it's you, Matt, because I know that was part of your sort of leaving gambit for us.
Yeah, well, it's a discussion point because I think it's not well defined yet. I think there are, you know, if you go into retail and you talk about a returns process, that's something that's well defined and well understood. But it's, you know, it's akin to that, isn't it? And you know, for me, I think reuse is a bigger opportunity in some construction projects. You know, we always tend to refer to an example as, you know, you could tear down a retail unit, but the cladding would be equally repurposed on an agricultural building for another 20 years, you know, and having that traceability and, you know, knowing the provenance of material before it gets reused or even recycled, so that you don't lose the integrity of the grade of steel in our case, or the plastics or anything else that's being used through the chain, is key. And I think, yeah, the capability to track and trace that through its service is one that automotive has started to deal with over the last decade. I must admit, I don't have a lens on construction in terms of how well progressed any of the thinking is around that, but I think the supply chain beyond end of use is something which will start to, I think, come into more focus.
Nigel, don't mean to pounce on you, from a design perspective, to what extent we're thinking about, say, design for manufacturing and assembly or modular assembly. What about design for the circular economy? To what extent is that permeating your practice at the moment?
I think it's climate change, and, you know, and all these sort of things are really, they're the elephant in the room. It's what has to govern all of our thinking, and it's certainly what we try and do. And we have developed tools, for example, digital tools, for example, something to measure embodied carbon, so that we can, but we know as we're designing what that is. So we're making rational decisions as we go. And so, you know, using BIM models and so on. And I think in terms of modern methods, it's about, I think the earlier session before ours was talking about digital and talking about digital twins. And I think the more that we can manage the products through their whole life, and digital twins, you know, seem like a good way of managing that, the better we can do. So a bit like all of I've been saying, I think we have to understand this right at the beginning when we're first putting, you know, virtual pen to paper. We have to understand what the life of the building, the life of the components will be, and how we might reuse them. So I think a lot of what we're doing, it's the climate change issue, climate emergency, really is at the root of all the decisions that we're making, or it should be at the root of all the decisions we're making. And circular economy is a big part of that. And I think using modern methods, as long as it means that we have time the opportunity to think about reuse later on, and in a digital environment, you know, is how it should be going.
Brilliant. Sarah, from the work that you've had been doing, how does this fit into this idea of value?
I think it's high on our agenda at Arcadis. I mean, we're just about to refresh our strategy, and this is #1 priority. We do a lot of work with the World Business Council for Sustainable Development, and you know, there's some white papers coming out on this topic shortly. I think it's really important. But more importantly, I do a lot of work with a lot of global multinational companies, big corporates, and they're looking at things like their real estate footprints, and you know, they're definitely rationalising there's a trend, and that trend's been coming for a long time, but they're also rethinking the spaces in terms of, well, what else can we use them for, and you know, how can we reuse what we've got? So they, you know, I think all companies, regardless of whether it's construction or not, are starting to think that way. But I just think there's a massive education push needed around a better understanding of, you know, when you do build something, you know, how do you to Matt's point, if there's cladding on something, how can you reuse it? How do you make that an easy process to sort of move something from one place to the other and take the friction out of the process? But it starts with educating people across quite a broad spectrum in a way that anybody on social media at the minute, there's everything going on around educating people around plastic, and it almost needs that kind of drive to it. I think it's such a big topic.
Yeah. Now, we've only got 4 minutes left, and there's one question. There's two things I want to do before the end. There's a question that's coming through. It's come through both chat and on the questions about retrofit, which sort of builds on something that Sarah, you were just saying about the reuse. And so I suppose there's just a question here: to what extent are the principles we're discussing, could they apply to the upgrade or the redevelopment of existing buildings and infrastructure as they do to new build, where perhaps much of the conversation has gone so far? I don't know. Lisa, is there anything that you've seen from your work on supply chain resilience more broadly around this?
I would say some of the same principles that Nigel has talked about in terms of thinking about, are there some basic sort of modular standard things that we can do in these old buildings? It's not going to be size, because there's different sizes and things like that, but there could definitely be materials. We don't have old buildings like you have buildings because our country's not that old. Our old buildings aren't that, but I think there can be some, but I don't think it's going to be as extensive. But I think Nigel probably has a good idea about that. Sorry, Nigel.
Well, I mean, just to pick up that baton, I think I'm not sure whether it's specifically to do with supply chain management, but I think there is, clearly the first design decision that we need to make is, can we reuse the existing asset in some way? And, we talk about long life loose fit, so we need to be thinking about designing buildings, not just that they could be disassembled at the end of their life and reused, but actually that they can be reused in largely their current form. So we don't really spend a lot of time measuring embodied carbon, but I think increasingly we will be, and I think those sort of decisions are really important. So as I say, I'm not sure that it's directly related to supply chain management, but it's nonetheless a really important issue.
I think what you're talking about is something that we call it's like a real option value. So you design something that could have multiple uses, as opposed to designing something that only has a specific use. And actually, it's a really important part of supply chain resilience, because actually some of the supply chains have been really badly hit. It's because they only do one thing or serve one market, whereas those supply chains or that can adapt and actually make other things or respond to different opportunities are the ones that have greatest longevity. But I think you make a great point that there is an embedded carbon of changing things, so we do need to think about how we can design, not have to tear it down and start again, but actually think about how we can do multiple things in the same space. Any quick additional comments from Sarah or
just
Matt?
Picking up on Nigel's point, I do come from a long time ago, come from a background of urban development, and 10 years ago, 15 years ago, there'd be single-use assets, there'd be a school, there'd be a community centre, there'd be a health centre, and we've sort of pushed the boundaries of that a little bit, but there's still a way to go around this multi-use asset environment, really optimising the asset. And I think there's still there's asset managers out there that don't like complexity, and that's sometimes part of the challenge.
Yeah. And Matt, embodied carbon is at the heart of Tata Steel thinking.
Well, it's a key factor in a debate, doesn't it? Because it can focus on maybe the wrong thing. We like to focus in steel on the kind of the whole reuse aspect of the material. Maybe as a final thought, in a decade or so, there'll be enough steel on the planet not to need to dig raw materials out of the ground anymore, and that's when we really need to think about that value chain working.
Okay. 10 seconds, one thing that people should take away, and as you're willing to say it, then just shout out.
Well, I just to start, I mean, just to reiterate, I think what was sort of my main point, which is I think we've got to embrace standardization, but for the architects out there, that doesn't mean a sort of homogeneous built environment. We can have this sort of mass customization, but we've really got to stop reinventing the wheel every time we start designing a new building.
Excellent. Who wants to go next?
I'd say better articulation of value as early as possible. I think real clarity on that so that the market knows what it's dealing with.
Lisa?
Top management level, people who are running these organizations, they need to embrace shared goals and not have procurement be driving the, the lowest cost. Procurement has to be accountable for value and recognized for it.
Yeah, value seems to be a common word. Matt?
Yeah, look, I think it's been an interesting discussion. I think the key thing here is that some of these principles absolutely apply. I think end-to-end visibility is going to be a massive enabler for the construction program end-to-end. And I think modular build as a concept is great. And I think I'm getting people to understand how you can postpone and configure late to avoid that feeling that it's going to kind of commoditize or cause uniformity is something to kind of win people over on as well.
So I would like to, on that note, thank you all very, very much. Firstly, for your presentations, which sparked the debate, but then for a really, really enriching debate. And I think it was really lovely to see the conversation flow. And I think you really built on each other's concepts to create a great discussion for our attendees. So just before I hand over to Jackie, I just would like to share with you, or give you advanced sight of a digest that we will be launching in the coming months. This is the third in a series of really quite informative digests that Network Plus has produced. Building on the debate, you'll be very interested in the first and second digests because they looked at platform thinking and ecosystems within construction. And this third one is really around how we can improve supply chain productivity in construction. And it actually begins to show some of those different roles beyond procurement that can be played, but also the importance of visibility and integration in achieving those goals. So please do look out for the digest over the coming month. And so it's now my great pleasure to hand over to our principal investigator, Professor Jackie Glass from UCL, who will bring today's proceedings to a close.
Well, thanks, Jan, and thank you to the speakers who have taken us through this session. We've gone all the way through the day. The sun has come all the way round and is on to me now for the closing few minutes of our conference. So pleasure from me to actually say thank you to everybody. I've just got a few closing thoughts really to capture some of our conversations that we've had through today. And I'm going to go A to Z, but I'm going to go from A to Z and I'm not actually going to do loads of letters in between. My A to start off is that actually I think we've very much established from the start today that this is an agenda for all. Whether you are a member of the local general public around a site, whether you are the leader of a business, whether you are a procurement professional or a designer, this is an agenda for all. We have heard from the start of the day some of the history of the construction industry. And we've heard about its troubles. We've heard about corruption. We've heard about what we call the dark side of business and the dark side of management, which is about poor payment. And very clearly early on there, we started to talk about payment and how payment practices are influencing precarity in our industry. So we picked up on precarity as a theme quite early on. Now, precarity is about profits. Precarity is about employment, but it's about livelihoods. So people were a strong theme all the way through the day, which I'm really pleased about actually. When we moved into our session around the digital and we asked whether digital was delivering, it became clear to me very early on that we were really seeing such an asymmetry of confidence. Whilst we have, and we can hear stories from people like John Antovy telling us about the story of how he's trying out new technologies, he's very keen to do so, he's joining things up. How wonderful to hear from such entrepreneurs. But my goodness me, haven't we got a lot of people to bring along with us as well? So we talked then about, I think we opened up a very interesting debate around ownership of information. I think that one's going to run and run. It links to intellectual property. It links to ownership. It links to the exchange of consideration around that data and that information. And I suppose that in a way, that's where we need to see John Antovy's vision of a connected construction as maybe that's our goal. Maybe it sounds straightforward, doesn't it? It's not straightforward, and we know that, but it is a compelling vision, and I really quite enjoy that. But it only becomes operable when we start to say, actually, I really like this phrase from Annabelle, can we create a new type of value? When we believe that there is a new type of value and we start actually organising our projects, organising our firms, such that we can capture and create and capture that value, then I think we're moving we really are moving the industry towards addressing the public good. In our session this afternoon, Jan, that you've chaired, thank you for that. I think we've picked up on a number of important points as well. And we draw then into this area where we start to think of the sector, the construction sector, as an ecosystem. Now, some people see this as a sort of an organism, you know, a sort of a shared fate ecosystem where everybody depends on one another. But from the stories we've heard this afternoon, what we know is that if we don't really address things like collaboration and accountability within those collaborations, then we really aren't going to be able to actually, embrace the shared goals. I think Lisa left us with that thought a few moments ago. So, closing in terms of the themes that we've picked up on today, it's been lovely to hear from people with so many different backgrounds. And actually, a phrase about the supply chain is based on what is designed. I asked a question in our first session. I asked people about the audiences they wanted to reach. And I think Nigel makes some very good points around designers and how they perceive some of these transformations that need to happen. So, this is now the time to embrace the movement for change. Early on in the day, Amanda Long asked us to put our arms around people we need to influence. We've been encouraged to get in the car and drive by other speakers. I'm certainly very keen to look at the transform aspect of this. The form of our businesses, the form of our sector needs to change. So a few thank yous then to close out. Thank you to all of you who have participated during the day. It's been wonderful to see questions coming up, comments. Thank you to all of our speakers that have taken part and contributed. Thank you to the chairs of the session discussion and bring out. And a very personal thank you from me to our Network Plus team, and particularly Doreen Fante and Lisa Hansel. But I can assure you have been working diligently and carefully in the background to make everything possible today. Jan, I promised I would finish off with an A to Z, and my Z is actually to thank Eric Yuan. Eric Yuan is the founder of Zoom. And of course, without the Z of Zoom, we would not have been able to do this today. So Zoom is a platform. We've talked about platforms. We've talked about collaboration. We've talked about conversations. I think it's been a wonderful day. Thank you all very much indeed for viewing. Please keep in touch. And I think with that, Jan, I think we will close out our conference for today. Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you very much.